This is just a report. It's not an action item. It's a report on police use of force. But I think it's important to talk about the issue of police use of force more than we do. Police shootings in Los Angeles, including fatal shootings, have been happening with an alarming frequency. Last year they were up 160%, and they seem to be on track this year. And they don't get talked about enough in these legislative chambers. There's a lot of big headlines about smash and grab robberies, and we take action. Television or even legislative debates will go into great detail about crimes committed by people who are unhoused. But there is not the same level of attention and scrutiny and therefore action when it comes to officer-involved shootings. And I would argue that it's something that needs to be focused on considerably more. I'd say we have a higher responsibility to focus on that than any of the other things I just mentioned, because these incidents are committed by us, by people who work for us. It's government use of force, and it's an agency that we supervise. And I think we have a heightened responsibility because it's the power of the state. And notably, we rely on the police in Los Angeles for pretty much everything. For homelessness, for mental health, for traffic, for crowd control. We rely on the police for everything. So this requires a lot of scrutiny. And it's not just that shootings happen, but it's also that the victims are disproportionately people of color. And it's also that there is little or no accountability. Last month, LAPD officers shot Jermaine Pettit, who was an unarmed black man in Leimert Park. Witnesses say they shot him in the back while he was running away. The department had to retract its initial claim that he was armed. He was actually carrying an auto part, which in a public Zoom meeting later, an LAPD official referred to as a non-functioning firearm. In June, LAPD officers fatally shot Martin Kua in Koreatown. The department said he pointed a gun at officers. The LA Times reports that the video released shows him running away. LAPD shot 22 people in the first 7 months of this year. 8 of them were fatal, and 3 of them happened in a single week in July. Police shootings in Los Angeles are statistically rare, as was pointed out in committee. But they are up dramatically over the past couple years. And the Mapping Police Violence Project reports that the situation in Los Angeles is graver than in most other places. We have more police shootings per arrest than 83% of the departments nationwide, more killings by police per arrest than 83% of the departments nationwide, and used more force per arrest than 48% of the departments. And as I mentioned, the impacts are racially disparate. In LA, African Americans make up 8% of the population, 19% of the police killings. Latinos, 48% of the population, and 61% of the police killings. And then there's the issue of accountability. An Inspector General report examined LAPD shootings from 2015 to 2020, and it found that 66 officers violated the department's deadly force policy in 45 incidents, in which 20 people were killed and 12 were wounded. Only one was fired. Of the 301 rounds that were fired during those incidents, 228 were ruled out of policy. That's what the report said. And of the 66 officers who violated deadly force policy, 20 received short unpaid suspensions, and 27 were not disciplined at all. And there's a long history of civilian oversight letting officers off the hook, even when the department's professional leadership, even when the management, even when the commission recommends disciplinary action. The police commission ruled that 12 SWAT officers violated deadly force policy in the 2017 fatal shooting of Anthony Soderberg, a burglary suspect who was fleeing in a ravine. The discipline panel overturned the ruling, finding all of the officers not guilty. In 2020, Chief Moore wanted to fire a detective who got drunk off duty and wandered into Skid Row and shot an unhoused person. the panel reduced the punishment to suspension. In May of 2015, an LAPD officer shot and killed Brendan Glenn, an unarmed homeless black man in my district in Venice. Even Chief Beck called for the officer to be prosecuted. Jackie Lacey didn't file charges. The accountability for police conduct is rare, not just for shooting, but as we've seen in the paper recently, for bias accusations or failure to render aid. Out of the more than 1,000 complaints of biased policing in 2021, the department upheld 0 of them. Now, many of them may be frivolous, many of them may be fraudulent, but does anyone believe that there are 0 cases? There's also serious questions about how these incidents are handled and how people who are shot are treated physically and legally. Jermaine Pettit, who I mentioned, who had an auto part and not a gun, is still facing a weapons charge. So is Joshua Hatfield, who was shot in June fleeing a traffic stop. LAPD says the officer thought he had a gun, and he didn't, but he's still facing a weapons charge, according to the LA Times. The LA Times also reports that officers routinely delay medical attention or take no steps at all to provide aid to victims of police shootings. And those officers, as the paper reported, are never punished despite a departmental policy requiring them to do so. The report before us today gives us numbers, and those numbers are important, but they don't tell the full story. And I'm extremely grateful to Councilwoman Rodriguez for asking, as part of this action, for regular reports to Council and to Public Safety Committee, and that they include not just the hard numbers, but also the circumstances behind each shooting. Because we need to know not just the circumstances, but we need to know the bigger picture, and we need to know more about what is being done to address this. The department has new policies and new trainings. Why aren't they more effective? Why is this problem continuing to get worse? The problem, as I said, is not just the violence, but the lack of accountability. And I think we need to acknowledge that, that this body, including me, made a serious error a few years ago when we proposed a charter reform amendment. Many of you weren't on the council yet. Proposed a charter reform amendment that significantly weakened police discipline. The only member of the council at the time who had the foresight to not support that was Mr. Harris Dawson, who expressed his concerns at the time. And while this is just a report and not an action item, I believe it's time to start having serious discussions about how we can revisit the question of how we do police discipline and police accountability to address the problem of use of force.